Hey guys, welcome to Ryan's Running Reviews. Today we're going to compare two of Altra's thickest road running shoes. It's the brand new Via Olympus and then the Paradigm 6. Now, the Paradigm is a stability shoe while the Via Olympus is a max cushion neutral shoe, but I do think they have a lot of similarities, so I'm excited to dive into it and have some hot takes here. Let's run with it. Before we get started, I do want to say that these shoes were provided to me by Roadrunner Sports. However, they didn't have a chance to preview this video, and this file synopsis is my own. I'd also like to say please leave a like on the video and consider subscribing, as it really helps me make these videos. Here we go. As far as the stats go, these shoes are very similar. They both cost $170. However, the Via Olympus has 33 millimeters of stack height in the heel and forefoot for the classic Zero Ultra drop and comes in at 11 ounces. Now, this is going to be slightly heavier compared to the Paradigm 6, which is 10.8 ounces and has 30 millimeters in the heel and forefoot, so 3 less millimeters of stack height compared to the Via Olympus. However, the biggest difference comes in the foot shape of both of these shoes. If you're not familiar, Altra has 3 different foot shapes. They have original, which is the widest, standard, and then slim, which is a little bit more performance fit. Now, the Via Olympus is going to be the original, so they're widest, while the Paradigm 6 is the standard, and this is where things start to get interesting. And because I was curious on the actual difference between the original foot shape and the standard foot shape, I took out the inserts and we can compare them here. So this is the original foot shape and this is the standard foot shape, and if you compare them, you'll see the original is slightly larger. So I decided to measure it, and per my calculations across the widest point of the forefoot, it's going to be 109 millimeters, while the widest point of the standard foot shape is 104. So the original foot shape, again, Altra's widest, gives you about 5 more millimeters of width. Now, there's a little bit extra room as you kind of get towards the top of the shoe, so it's kind of hard to calculate that exact, total surface area change, but it is, again, about 5 extra millimeters wider compared to the standard foot shape we saw on the Paradigm. Now, for me personally, this wasn't massively noticeable, but it is just like a slight difference. It just wasn't a huge, massive game changer for me. So after comparing the original foot shape to the standard foot shape, I was curious about Altra's slim foot shape. So I have one of their shoes which has that slim foot shape profile, which is the Rivera. Took out the insert, and I'll bring in that insert here, and we'll compare it to the standard insert. So you can see they look very similar, and to my best guess, they're practically the same. The forefoot has the same width, and the heel, to my best ability, it's hard to measure because of the curvature, looks about the same too. It's very, very close. Now, it's hard to tell exactly the total volume of the toe box and all of that, and to measure that precisely, but if you measure the inserts, the standard and the slim look pretty much identical. So the only real difference, to my knowledge and my best guess here, is that the original does give you about 5 more millimeters of width, which I know you have a little extra surface area. You got to do the calculus, the area under the curve, and all that fun stuff. But it does give you about 5 extra millimeters of more width if you go with the original. So kind of interesting. The slim fit and the standard fit had the same kind of insert, while the original does give you a slightly wider insert, only 5 more millimeters. And again, for me, it wasn't massively noticeable. You can notice it just wasn't like a massive game changer for me. Moving on to the upper, while I enjoyed both, I did find the Olympus to have a better lockdown and a higher level of comfortability, if that's even a word. The Olympus had more padding in the ankle and Achilles area, a more well-padded tongue, and while both tongues are non-gusseted, I wish Altra would just gusset their tongues and make life much better. I did find the tongue on the Via Olympus to be a little bit more of a lower profile and move around less. And something else I do want to point out, in the Via Olympus, they have these rough edges towards the middle of the midfoot. Doesn't really impact performance or comfort. It just looks a little bit, I guess, untidy, if you will. Again, no impact on performance. It just looks kind of strange for a $170 shoe to have these rough edges with open ends of fabric. I don't know if this is a defect on my model, but I figured I'd point it out nonetheless. And I know I talked a lot about this before earlier on in the video, but I will bring this up again. The original foot shape of the upper does give you a little bit more room towards the lateral top edge of the toe box. Otherwise, it felt somewhat similar. Again, it's just a small, slightly noticeable bit of extra room in the toe box. It's just not a massive amount. And I was surprised when I compared the two inserts how close that difference was. The other thing I'll say is the Paradigm has this medial strap here, which you can kind of adjust to give you more medial support. Didn't notice it all that much, didn't really use it ever. On the Paradigm, it had it as well, and they took that off. Sorry, the Provision had that medial strap as well, and they took it off. So here on the Paradigm, I expect this medial strap to get kind of cut on the next version. So that is something to consider if you're looking at the Paradigm 6 versus the Via Olympus. It does have that medial strap, which can help you, but for me personally, didn't notice it, and I expect it to be kind of removed on the next version. So overall, if I have to give the award to, I guess, more comfort, I will say the Via Olympus wins, although I was quite happy with both shoes, and I do wish that Altra would gusset their tongues, and the fact that the one on the Via Olympus is a little bit shorter, it makes it more manageable and it moved around a bit less. And now for the part you've all been waiting for. Let's talk about the midsoles. And if you're not familiar, Altra has 3 different kinds of midsole foams. They have Ego, which we see on the Provision, EgoMax, which both of these midsoles have, and then Ego Pro, which we see on the Vanish Carbon and Vanish Tempo, which are like their race day shoes. Now I have to be honest that the Altra v Olympus did let me down a little bit initially, just because it didn't meet my expectations of what I was thinking to get out of this shoe. And a big reason for that was my experience with the Paradigm. Put a lot of time into this shoe, really liked it. EgoMax foam was incredibly comfortable, rather soft, had a little bit of bounce to it for an Ultra shoe, and I wore it a lot casually just because of how comfortable it was. So when I saw the Ultra v Olympus coming out, I was like, oh, this is gonna be great. Even more EgoMax foam, because they're technically both EgoMax foam, at least branded as such. So when I tried on the shoe, it was just incredibly kind of firm. It felt nothing like the Paradigm. This is a very firm midsole. So it's just a completely different experience, even though they're both EgoMax. Now I will say it's not a bad shoe, it's just completely different than what I was expecting with the Paradigm. So this version of EgoMax, whatever compound setup or formulation they used, is much more firm. I would say it's even more firm than the Ego foam we see on the Provision. So this is a very firm setup of EgoMax and much more firm compared to the Provision, or sorry, Paradigm here. Always get them mixed up. And even though the Via Olympus is a much more firm shoe, and once I readjusted my expectations, I really grew to like this new model. And a big reason for that is the rocker geometry, and has a much more noticeable toe-off sensation, while the Paradigm really doesn't have that noticeable rocker. It's a slight rocker, but it's much more noticeable in the Via Olympus. That's because the shoe is going to be much more stiff and have a much more firm base. The other thing I'll say is the Paradigm is geared or is branded as a stability shoe because you have these things called guide rails, which are walls of foam on both the medial and lateral side, kind of keep your foot going the correct direction. And there's no branded guide rails here on the Via Olympus. But I will say, if you kind of feel around on the shoe, you have some mini guide rails on the lateral and medial side. So they don't brand them as guide rails, but your foot does sit lower within the midsole, giving you some guidance if you want it. So it's a neutral shoe. It's not branded as a stability shoe, but I found it to be quite stable with that very firm midsole and mini kind of guide rails on both sides, even though they're not branded as such. So overall, with regard to my personal experience of these two midsoles, I found there's a lot of daylight between the two. They feel very different, even though they both have EgoMax foam. The Via Olympus, much more firm, has a much more noticeable rocker geometry, and is very stable, even though it's billed as a neutral shoe with those unofficial guide rails on the lateral and medial side, because again, you kind of feel it. Your foot just sinks in a little bit lower into the midsole, which gives you a little bit support and kind of encapsulates your foot. So still a neutral shoe, but feels very stable. I was also kind of happy with how I was able to kind of get up on my toes and going, because you have that firm base and rocker geometry. It's a very stiff shoe, even though there's no plate in it. I was able to kind of pick up the pace a little bit more than I was in the Paradigm. Paradigm's gonna be a little bit softer, have a little bit more squish, a little bit more bounce to it. Found the midsole to be a little bit more comfortable if you like the softer side of things, and is going to be slightly more stable as you have those large guide rails on both the medial and lateral side. Moving on to the outsole, you do have a very similar setup here. I will say it's kind of interesting they have the Interflex technology, which basically means these lines here are supposed to kind of correlate with the bones and tendons in your feet, but there's too much midsole on both of these shoes for that kind of Interflex motion to occur, so I don't know if that's really the case here, but I thought the grip was fine. It's nothing too crazy. It's pretty standard for a road shoe. You do have a little bit of exposed foam through the middle and back half of the shoe, which I assume is to help lose some weight. And comparing the surface area of the bottom of the shoes, again, this is the original foot shape and this is the standard. I was expecting a little bit more of a difference because they seem pretty darn close. The Via Olympus is maybe a couple millimeters more wide, so you do have slightly more surface area here, but they are pretty darn comparable. And I will say they're just a couple millimeters of a difference. So it's not a massive change between the surface area between the Paradigm 6 and the Via Olympus. So let me know down in the comments your thoughts on these two shoes. What do you think of this setup of EgoMax foam? Do you like this rocker geometry in Ultra shoes? And what are you looking for out of Ultra shoes in the future? Love to hear from you. Well, I'm Ryan from Ryan's Running Reviews, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Thanks.